Okay, welcome back. My name is Ken Mayer, Professor of Political Science here at UW and one of Barry's colleagues at the Election Research Center. It is my pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Grace Panetta, who is a political reporter for the 19th, which is an independent journalism source that covers gender, politics, and policy. Prior to that, she spent 4 years as a political reporter for the Business Insider. And a special note for the students who are here, Grace has a bachelor's in political science from Barnard College, where she actually worked with someone that I have done research with on campaign finance and voter ID. Just a reminder that we have Levi will be wandering the room, circulating the room if you have questions that you want to ask in the Q&A on the index cards. And for the folks who are online, we've got the chat function on the Zoom link. Without further ado, Grace.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the Elections Research Center for having me. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you and to talk about gender and politics, one of my favorite topics. Just find the... So previous elections have been dubbed a year of the woman, like 1992, like 2018, but I kind of feel like that term is almost a bit outdated. And I believe that we are now in a democra-she. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And what do I mean when I say that? So first, let's start with what we know about women voters. We know that really over the last several decades, women have consistently been registered to vote and turned out to vote at higher rates than men in presidential, non-presidential elections. There are a couple of charts that speak to this from the Center for American Women in Politics, which is another great source for all things gender and politics. And so we know that women participate in politics at greater rates than men. But when this is a point we try to make a lot at the 19th, is that women voters are not an interest group or a monolith. Women voters have a lot of different interests in voting behaviors, and that's why it's more helpful to kind of break it down by other intersections like race, educational attainment, those sorts of things. And so these are just a couple of some of the exit polls from this year. I know exit polls are not perfect. I'm not going to use them to make any sweeping conclusions. Don't worry, anyone. But this is just kind of an interesting from some of the CNN Edison Research exit polls that Democrats actually lost ground among women voters as a whole in 2022. And then when you kind of look at the breakdown of some of these racial groups and gender, you see some shifts as well. But as we heard a lot about in the last presentation from Kyle, Democrats did a lot better than expected this year, and women played a very significant role in that. And firstly is with the issue of abortion. Now, it's not been always the case at all that abortion has been primarily defined as an issue by gender. It's long been the case in a lot of polling over the last 30 years that partisanship and religion are actually much better predictors for someone's views on abortion than their gender. For example, evangelical versus non-evangelical, liberal, conservative, but a gender gap emerged this year. And this was touched on in the last presentation, but a couple things that were really unique about the Supreme Court's decision overturning Roe v. Wade was that it was the party out of power having a major political victory in a midterm year, and one that turned out to be pretty unpopular and a mobilizing factor. And we see a couple of the indicators in the data for why this was the case. And it's also important to note that it was not just this effect of a right being taken away, but the immediate passage and enactment of abortion bans, strict abortion bans in states across the country. Here in Wisconsin, previous abortion bans on the books going back into effect. So we see here, this is some data from AP Votecast and the Kaiser Family Foundation about showing to what extent abortion was a major factor in people's voting decisions and which candidates they supported. We saw almost 50% of voters said the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade had a major impact on which candidates they supported. And also in uniquely firing up women, this on the right is an essay written by Tom Bonnier. He's a progressive political strategist, data analyst, and he was one of the ones in the fall kind of citing this counter narrative that Democrats could have an upset and outperform expectations. And he pointed to this huge surge of women registering to vote over the summer. And this is something I was a little, cautious about because registration rates don't necessarily translate into votes at the ballot box. Registration can sometimes be a lagging indicator, but he was right. He was one of the people who actually got the midterms right and picked up on this trend that was emerging. And there was a lot of speculation in the media and among Democratic strategists in the fall that, the impact of abortion was fading into the background, economy, inflation, maybe crime were more important. And there were fears about, there being a red wave, including things like Biden's poor approval ratings, which we heard Kyle talk about, but that wasn't the case. And why was that? Well, this was the answer within the data the entire time, pretty consistently in the polling this year and in previous years. As Roe v. Wade has been pretty popular among the American public, and the overturning of Roe v. Wade was quite unpopular. In most polls, it's something like 60 to 65% of Americans oppose the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. About 35% support it. And also the fact that the strict abortion bans that went into place and had a material impact on people's lives were even more unpopular. The 19th, actually, we partnered with SurveyMonkey and did some polling in late summer, early fall, and we found that 10% of Americans overall and 13% living in states that had passed abortion bans opposed those bills. Making abortion illegal, as it turned out, was very, very unpopular, and 61% of Americans we found in that poll overall, and 52% in those states that had passed strict abortion bans, which tend to be pretty conservative, supported abortion being legal in all or most cases. So you saw a lot of policymakers being very out of step with what their constituents actually wanted. And as it turned out, that was a mobilizing force. And I think a poll that really did, shortly before the election, accurately capture this dynamic was the Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings Institution American Values Survey. This is an annual survey. It's a really, really good comprehensive poll. And this is an article I wrote based on some of that data, that abortion was not the top voting issue for most Americans. That was pretty consistent in the polling before the midterms, but it was motivating them to turn out, which is very important in midterms because the default we have to realize in midterm elections is to not turn out at all. But abortion turned out to be one of those things that got people to turn out to vote, even if they were rating things like the economy and inflation as more important issues. And so you can see here, this is from this poll, you see, the increasing costs of housing and everyday expenses and the health of democracy were more important than abortion. But if you look at the chart on the right, you can see some really, really interesting results. Among all Americans, the 28% said they were very excited to vote in November, but that number went up to 45 when they were asked, how excited are you to vote when thinking about the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade? We especially see that big jump in enthusiasm among Democrats as compared to Republicans, and the gender gap that we now see emerging over abortion. Women more likely than men to say that they're very motivated by the issue of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, a gap among Democratic women versus Democratic men, an even larger gap among independent women versus independent men. And that is actually very, very significant and is just pointing to this larger gender gap we see on the issue of abortion and how it mobilized people to turn out. Another change, and this I think is extremely, extremely important for our understanding of not just 2022, but how the issue of abortion is going to factor in future elections, is this idea of it being a litmus test. For the longest time when Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, it was primarily Republicans who saw, a candidate needing to share their position on an issue of abortion, especially evangelical voters, more conservative voters. This is extremely important. Now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned, that's flipped. So not only have the percentage of voters who say a candidate must share their view on abortion to earn their vote gone up over the past 10 years, but this partisan gap has flipped since 2020. I think this is a pretty remarkable finding of this poll. In 2020, you had a little over 30% of Republicans and 17% of Democrats saying that abortion was a litmus test for, choosing who to vote for. And now in 2022, it was 35% of Democrats and 21% of Republicans saying that. And this is, maybe an issue for Republicans, long term, because this issue of abortion is not going away. And then we also see this gender gap in addition to the partisan gap. Women more likely than men to say that they'll only vote for candidates who share their views on abortion. Another interesting gap along the lines of age are women in the 30 to 49 age group, so millennials, Gen X, much more likely than men in their same age group to say that they'll only vote for candidates who share their views on abortion. This is very important for understanding of 2022 in the long term. And what was the result? Kyle touched on this in the last presentation, but it resulted in Democrats who disapproved of the president in power, Joe Biden, voting for Democrats. And that turned out to be very, very significant. And a couple of questions I want to quickly touch on that were also mentioned in the last presentation, was there a huge rise in ticket splitting, and was there a youthquake of Gen Z voters turning out to vote? The answer, and we still need some more data, especially on this question of youth voter turnout, because right now we really only have some exit poll data and a little bit of voter data. But nationally, this is a chart from a Politico article. The median gap between a state's gubernatorial and Senate results is actually very low nationwide, but in key states like Wisconsin, like Nevada, like Georgia, it did make a huge difference. And then as far as the youth vote goes, there's some disagreement among the experts about how big the youthquake was, but again, same deal, the youth vote and I think youth organizing on campuses did play a really, really key role in swing states like here in Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia. This bottom screenshot is from an article my colleague Barbara Rodriguez wrote about young women working to get out the vote in the wake of Dobbs. And when you think about now in this polarized era, how elections are really won and lost at the margins and, won and lost in a few counties in some states, this kind of organizing and mobilization does really make a difference. And the next thing I want to turn to is women being on the front lines of our very democracy outside of the realm of electoral politics and the role they play in running elections and securing democracy. We know that the professional election workforce is very female dominated. About 80% of local election officials are women, according to one 2020 survey. 75% are over the age of 50, over 90% are white, and women do face higher rates of sexist harassment than they bear the brunt of just the toll that conspiracy theories, misinformation, efforts to overturn elections, just distrust in the system are causing. So these are also a couple articles written by my colleague, Barbara. Conspiracy theories, records, requests, and lies. That's what running an election looks like right now. Even though the 2022 midterms were very smooth on that front, there were not any kind of major voting meltdowns or disasters. It's just this sort of broader toll it takes on the system. Another article she wrote in July about an Arizona Republican who left her job. This was part of a larger exodus in the professional election workforce. We're seeing that is female dominated. And then on the electoral front, we saw a number of female candidates who ran, fully or partly on denying the results of the last election, closely tying themselves to former President Trump and running on this sort of distrust in the system. We all saw them losing. And back to this point about ticket splitting, voters in some of these states did make very nuanced choices. So in Arizona, voters rejected Carrie Lake, Blake Masters, the Secretary of State candidate Mark Fincham, who all ran on this platform, but reelected the Republican state treasurer who did not get into any of that stuff. In Michigan, voters rejected the gubernatorial nominee, Tudor Dixon, and Christina Caramo, who was running to be the chief election official. So we see this kind of repudiation of election denial across the board, also to the point made in the last session about how voters are more sophisticated a lot of times than we give them credit for. But at the same time, make no mistake, election denial, it's not going away. This top screenshot is from a 538 article that's citing a very, very interesting finding in a Morning Consult poll that 60% of Republican men said they saw the midterms as free and fair, even though the party lost ground, versus only 44% of the party's women, which is a gender gap that has remained in place since January of 2021. And that to me is a fascinating finding and something I'm curious about. Why do more Republican women than men distrust the system? And then we see also a lot of female candidates who ran on this platform, not immediately conceding. Carrie Lake being one of them, or conceding but saying, oh, there was fraud. And so I think especially at the local level, even as we see the Secretary of State candidates losing, this is still going to be an issue and a challenge for the system going forward. And something that I'm really curious about, and I don't have an exact answer to yet, but I've been thinking a lot about in this context, is the role of the women of the January 6 hearings. As Kyle mentioned, it's very possible, likely, that the January 6 hearings by the committee investigating the attack on the Capitol played a bigger role in voters' decisions than we might think or may give it credit for. And just thinking about the spectrum of the women who came forward to testify, have a Capitol police officer, Caroline Edwards, talking about the very visceral experience of putting her body on the line to defend the Capitol. It's sort of similar themes of the abortion, the role that abortion played. former White House officials. To this point about young women, Cassidy Hutchinson is one of them, Sarah Matthews, another who came forward to testify. And then the two local election officials, mother-daughter, Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, who detailed the threats, the harassment, the experience that really upended and destroyed their lives. And, you know, any time a woman comes forward to like tell their story, it's always the question of, will this matter? Will this make a difference? And I think we can say from the midterms, made some impact, but what extent it did is a really, really interesting question. I think this ties up a lot of the themes we've been talking about today of threats to democracy, the role of citizenship, the role people play as active citizens. I think we've all learned a lot about what local election officials, for example, do in the past few years, but it definitely has cemented that, you know, it's easy to make sweeping generalizations, but the role of women voters, women organizers, the women running our elections did make a huge impact and cannot be discounted. And that's why I contend we're now in a democra-she. So thank you all so much. Looking forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you for that. So one thing I wanted to ask two kind of additional pieces of the story about gender and voting. One of them is about the relationship between gender and age, that younger women were the gender gap, which was about 8 points for all voters, was something like 20 points, 23 points for people under the age of under 30, I think. And the other is that we know that white women still as a group voted Republican. So the second piece of that is about the intersection of not just gender and age, but gender, age, and race. And then the third piece of that is how enduring you think these patterns are going to be. Are they going to stick around?
Oh, yes, so many fascinating questions. First, on this age point, I think one really important trend that's going to shape our politics for a while is the fact that Generation Z is very, very, very supportive of abortion rights. And that's for a couple of reasons. That Gen Z, you know, has more liberal overall than older generations and also less religious. I think this decline in religiosity, church attendance, these are really, really important political forces. And so in the PARI and Brookings poll I cited in my presentation, they found that Gen Z and younger millennial women, 46% of those aged 18 to 29 said that they were very motivated to vote in the wake of the Dobbs decision. That's very significant. And then along racial lines, I think, you know, it kind of remains to be seen if this was kind of a standout midterm year, part of a broader trend. We know that in 2020, for example, Republicans made a lot of ground among Latino voters, both men and women, more so among men than women. And this year, it seems like they did better compared to 2018, for sure, among Latino voters. And I think that, you know, it's also like the same way that women are not a monolith. It's important to note that Hispanic Latino voters are also not monoliths and cannot be all lumped together. But these are very important demographics for both parties going forward. I do think that Democrats should not get complacent about the results this year as it relates to Latino women, Black women, Asian AAPI women. These are all really important constituencies. And so I'm interested for more data on how that breaks down. But I really do think that this sort of decline in religiosity is going to be kind of one of the biggest forces driving age gaps and sort of racial gaps among within the subset of women voters.
So I'm going to take the liberty to ask one more question before we open it up. In the first presentation, Kyle Kondik said something about one of the effects of the Dobbs decision. It was not just the immediate effect of the decision itself and the reaction to that and opposition to that, but it became, the word that he used, as a news peg. It became a way to frame a larger set of arguments about extremism, and, you know, provided an organizational method for a larger set of arguments. Counterfactuals are always hard, but what's your sense of those two types of effects?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the reason why the Dobbs decision and the resulting abortion bans are so devastating for Republicans were that they're extremely unpopular among the American people, including among people who identify as conservative or Republican. We saw this in the summer when Kansas held a ballot referendum on removing the right to abortion from the state constitution. That amendment was defeated by something like 18 points. In a state like Kansas, that does not happen without a lot of votes to vote down that amendment from people who identify as conservative, people who voted for Trump. That amendment lost not only in the 5 counties that voted for Biden, but in something like 15 of ones that voted for Trump. So that was the first thing. And then the other thing I think is that Republicans as a whole didn't have a unified message on abortion. And there's been a lot of sort of kind of public infighting with an anti-abortion movement since the election. You had some who, did embrace supporting abortion bans, others who kind of tried to muddy the waters, some candidates editing language out of their campaign websites or just not wanting to talk about the issue, running from it. And it's, hard when it's something that's unpopular already, but I think the lack of a unified message did hurt them overall.
Okay, so this is a question from the audience. What are your thoughts about some of the reasons why such a large percentage of election officials are women? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just part of a broader trend of local civil service, people who work in local government being predominantly a female in a lot of places. I don't have exact numbers, but I think that is part of it. I also think it's kind of like sort of just a culture around, working in elections. Like there's also the fact that the majority in a lot of places of poll workers, people who sign up to work at the polls are women, and then a lot of them will become professional election officials. And it's hard. It's also hard to draw broad conclusions. It's like kind of as you know, Ken, in the sort of election administration nerd world, it's like no one grows up thinking that they're going to run elections at the local or state level. It's a field that people get into for a number of reasons. But I think it's just the fact that local government in general, in that sort of civil workforce, is already female dominated.
So I'll never object to being called an election nerd. To tell students that I was a classical nerd in high school. I was both on the chess team and president of the Magic Club, so I have the nerd covered. We have a question online from the League of Women Voters who expresses fascination by the results to say that there are more Republican women express distrust in the election system than men. Not only what might account from that, and the question is any of that attributed to the fact that obviously when there are polls done about who says self-identifies as a public, that's not static, that people will come and go from the party. Is there any reason to think that some people leaving the party or telling pollsters that they're not Republicans, might that explain some of this?
Oh yeah, very, very possibly. Yeah. As you mentioned, it's important, party people self-identify as parties that fluctuates over time. So yeah, it's entirely possible that the sample of Republican women is smaller because more women may have left the party or stopped identifying as Republican in the last several years. So those who were left and do, identify as a Republican tend to have views, further to the right and maybe more distrustful of election results for that reason. That could be part of it. But yeah, it's a fascinating finding. And there's some other polls finding that women are also more susceptible to believe in broader conspiracy theory movements like QAnon, and maybe more, easily targeted by some of that. But it's an open question. It's a really interesting one.
Okay. Another question from the audience of thinking about the connection between gender and age and the response to Dobbs. What do you think might be going on or prospectively with voting patterns of women who are attending college? And also this came up, there's a poster outside from some students who were working on this. You know, the question is, do you think opposition to or reaction to Dobbs is going to have an effect on where college-age women decide that they're going to go to school or take particular colleges off their lists because of the states in which those colleges are located?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll definitely become a factor in the years to come. It's too soon to tell yet, maybe, but yeah, it's because that's a huge decision for students and parents to decide, where you're going to go and spend your time for 4 years. And, I think a lot of people may opt against going to school in a state that's hostile to reproductive rights, because it's not just about abortion. Obviously, attacks on reproductive rights and freedom are not just limited to abortion specifically, and that could very well make a difference. Also, yeah, in college attendance and hiring. And to this other point about voting behavior, it is, we saw obviously this year that college-aged women in Generation Z are very, very supportive of abortion rights. We're very mobilized to vote by abortion rights, and in a lot of cases, organized on campuses, because, it is that generation has already seen quite a lot of political turmoil in the past 20 years that they've been alive, but also have not known a world before there was Roe v. Wade, and don't know what that was like. So I think it is uniquely mobilizing for people of that age group.
Okay. Another question from the audience, a question about mobilization on both sides, that clear evidence that Dobbs played a role in mobilizing women voters in general who opposed the decision. What about pro-life voters? Was there any effect that you see or that we can detect about how they reacted to it and the relationship, whether that served as a mobilizing force?
Yeah, I think the mobilizing effect of abortion decreased for voters who already opposed abortion rights. Particularly, there are some interesting findings in that PRI survey about evangelical voters and the mobilizing effect of abortion for them plummeting since 2020. Because, the Supreme Court has achieved that 45-year project of the anti-abortion pro-life movement and overturning Roe v. Wade. And so it's become less mobilizing at this point. And that's something that the anti-abortion groups involved in elections are going to have to figure out and are trying to figure out now. There have been a few articles with some leaders in those movements talking on the record about what the path to looks like going forward from here, maybe less reliant on electoral outcomes. But that is, I think especially looking towards 2024 for presidential candidates are going to have to think about the fact that it is, now that Roe v. Wade's overturned, it is less of a mobilizing issue, especially with the conservative majority installed on the Supreme Court, in addition to it being broadly unpopular among the general electorate. So they think this is a very significant shift.
So I want to follow up on that and make so the connection when most public opinion polls say that a very large percentage of the public, 70–80%, disagrees with the position that abortion should be banned in most or all circumstances. And given that level of public opposition to strict bans or tighter regulation, would you have expected to see an even bigger effect that wasn't quite reflected in mobilization that people would have expected when the decision was handed down, that the effect would have been even larger than it was? I
don't think necessarily. I think the fact that the results were what they were alone showed the mobilizing power of abortion in a Democratic midterm with an unpopular president. Obviously thinking about some of the results at the House level that we heard Kyle talk about, Republicans did win back the House in part because of gains in places like New York, where abortion is legally protected for now, and some other blue states. But I think what the results that really do show how much of an impact abortion and the overturning of Roe v. Wade had, but I personally did not fully expect. We're at the state legislative level. In 2020, Republicans flipped something like 85 seats in total in a chamber, even as Biden won the White House and Democrats kept the House. And this year in a Democratic midterm, saw Democrats flipping several chambers And Republicans only winning a couple dozen seats on balance nationwide. And I think that more than anything speaks to the power of abortion and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because it is state level officials and legislatures actually making these laws now in this post-Roe world.
Okay, so I think everybody appreciates the shout out for the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers. One of the things that we know about, or that has been fairly well established, is that women face disadvantages when running for office, a lack of support from existing institutions, lack of access to traditional fundraising networks. Do you think there's going to be a downstream effect of all of this with, I haven't seen the numbers for 2022 about the number of women who were elected to state legislative or congressional or Senate positions, but thinking about where we're going to be 10 or 12 years from now, looking back, do you expect to see a little bump in those numbers and percentages?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And this is something we heard before the election from groups that recruit and train women, Democratic women, to run for office. There's a massive surge in interest. And some of the early stats we have from the Center for American Women in Politics show that more women now have been elected to governorships for the first time since 2004. I think there's now a record high number of women serving in state legislatures. But at the same time, even as there's all this progress, women candidates do face a lot of disadvantages. There's some interesting research from the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, another great resource for research on gender and politics, that found that also this year there were a lot of races with more than one women candidate. And even in those races, women incumbents received less of an incumbency advantage than a male candidate would. And a lot of voters' kind of sexist assumptions and beliefs did not go away in races with more than one female candidate. So just more women running doesn't mean that a lot of these structural biases are going to go away overnight.
Okay, so on a related topic, a related question about the connection between the large number of women in election administration positions and the attacks on, and then not just the number of attacks, but the nature of the attacks. Is this something that we're noticing just because of the numbers, or I mean, I think I know what the answer to this question is, but is it the gender of the officials that is the fact that they are women make the attacks more likely, and also shape the types of things that people say when when criticizing them?
Yeah, it's definitely both. The fact that it's already a women-dominated workforce means that the women in those positions face the brunt of these attacks on the system. And then also, a lot of these attacks are very, very gendered. And even sort of these attacks on the system are not limited to women serving in election positions. So for example, in 2020, the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, shared how his wife had received harassment and threats. She's not a public official, but she received these, threats, sexualized harassment that was directed at her and not at her husband. And so I think it's just part of this broader trend of harassment against public officials in public life, and sort of this gender-based violence. So it's really all connected. It's a circular pattern.
So just to kind of continue this this thread, there have always been complaints and kind of conspiracy theories about elections, but the intensity certainly ratcheted up after 2020. It's not something that was common in the way that it is now before then. And it always struck me that one of the reasons that that they had become so prominent is no one had really paid an electoral penalty for either making these attacks or sort of winking at them because they were politically useful. Now we have a set of results in 2022 where some, not all, but some, and some of the most prominent election deniers were, they lost. I mean, do you see, is the intense, we're going to see a ratcheting down of these attacks now that it has political risks that were not clearly apparent before.
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent. And, I think it's been a broader trend really since the 2000 election of more and more litigation around election rules and results, definitely more partisanship and politicization of the election process. But obviously 2020 was like nothing that had been seen before in recent memory. And I do think, and it's interesting too, thinking about 2020 versus 2022, because it actually takes a lot of time, resources, money, and dedication to really try to overturn an election result the way that former President Trump did. He had this massive war chest and he was, a true believer. He really believed the election had been stolen. And that is not so much the case for a lot of the candidates who ran on that platform and lost this year. Like Doug Mastriano realized, at a certain point, he was just going to concede and not spend all this money trying to fight the election. Carrie Lake in Arizona is contesting her loss a bit, but it's nothing like we saw. I think a lot of candidates don't want to pay the financial and time cost of litigating over election results when they've lost by pretty clear margins. It's, proven to be politically very unpopular, but I would say keep an eye on the local level, because a lot of these fights have played out most prominently sort of in counties and cities. Like if we think about in Maricopa County, Arizona, the unofficial partisan audit done by Cyber Ninjas, that's where a lot of these fights are happening, especially considering the exodus of talented, longtime professionals working in elections at the local level and, who's going to take their place. I think that it's similar to the anti-abortion movement. They've lost ground, but they're not going away by any stretch.
Okay, so we've got a question from one of the Zoom viewers, which I'm actually going to paraphrase. We saw that support for Democratic candidates among women overall went down between 2018 and 2022. It also went down overall among support for Democrats among minority groups. But what's going on there? We have, is that just kind of a stochastic variation, or is there something driving that? Is it differences in the voters who were motivated to turn out? And again, the reason I think this is kind of a puzzle is that if in the summer of 2022, if you were speculating, what is the breakdown going to be of partisan support by women for Democrats? Is it going to go up or down based on from 2018? I mean, it seems like the expectations, like you would expect that the support to go up, and instead it went down. What's going on there? Yeah,
so I think this is a case of sort of national effects versus effects and voting behavior in the states that decided control, for example, the Senate and governorships. Nationwide, it's really not surprising that support for Democratic candidates went down among women voters, voters of color across different racial groups, because, it is a midterm still. It's a very weird midterm, but these effects are still present across the board. But now in these polarized times, we're in elections really are won and lost at the margins. In many cases, just down to a few thousand, 10,000 voters in one state or another, just a few counties that are now the decision makers. And so that's where you can see Democratic candidates winning and overperforming, even as the national story is that those candidates have lost support as compared to the last midterm.
Another question from the audience is, as someone who has, made a career out of observing these factors and particular interest in the voting behavior of women and women candidates, if you were advising a candidate who was running for office, and we'll just leave it at that, a woman who was running for office, what would you tell them about things they can do, the attributes that they should highlight to, I'll use the language in the question, to outcompete her male opponent?
Ooh, very interesting. Yeah, I definitely hate giving this answer. It really depends on what party she's in.
Well, actually, that's important, because there are two different groups. So first you're advising a Republican candidate.
Okay. So we're a Republican woman. It's interesting this year. There are a lot of really interesting women candidates we can think about in Republican primaries, some who lost against their male opponents. Think about in Ohio, Jane Timken was the only female candidate in a very, very rancorous, tumultuous, almost clown car Republican Senate primary, including J.D. Vance and Josh Mandel, and she didn't come out on top. But then we also saw in Alabama, Katie Britt, a more establishment figure, defeating Mo Brooks, formerly very pro-Trump congressman who's since turned on Trump, and that's its own drama. And so I think so, for example, thinking about what Katie Britt did to win in a deep red state like Alabama, she really leaned into her ties to the state and her experience. I think experience is one that unfortunately women candidates have to do more work to prove their experience and their qualifications than men. This is true in both parties. So that was one. And then also kind of focusing on results, especially, so in her case, for example, she's running to succeed Richard Shelby, very powerful senator who used his position to direct lots of money back to Alabama. So yeah, it also depends if it's open or an incumbent race, but I think, yeah, women do have to do more to prove their qualifications and experience, and also have potentially, as we saw this year, have maybe less room to really go towards one extreme or the other.
Okay, Democratic candidate.
Yeah. Again, also, yeah, I think on the Democratic side, it's thinking about some of the interesting primaries this year. A lot have been more about like ideology. So in a really interesting case, thinking about where a woman candidate defeated a male opponent is in Western Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh. Longtime Democratic congressman retired. And there's Summer Lee, who's a very progressive Black woman from the state legislature, running against a male candidate who was receiving a lot of support from pro-Israel lobby. And she overcame a lot of that outside spending and won, I think, in large part by, sort of emphasizing her own experience, matching more what the district wanted out of a representative. And money, it can be significant, but it's not everything. And so I think, especially in congressional state legislative elections, really being on the ground and in the community and is something that I think a lot of winning candidates had in common this year.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up on something that you didn't say based on one of the questions we have from the audience, which is about the relationship between candidate behavior and conservative, or we'll leave the conservative and liberal out of this, but particular conceptions of masculinity and femininity, how those play a role in how candidates, particularly women candidates, present themselves. And the reason I'm jumping on this is that you talked a little bit about some of the systemic problems about lack of experience and money and connections, but you didn't say anything about gender roles. And I wonder if that adds anything to the discussion.
Oh, it absolutely does. Oh, there's so much I could say on this. This is also a topic, by the way, that my boss she's obsessed with this concept of masculinity, femininity on the campaign trail. So Terry, if you're watching, yeah, I think this year we saw this play a huge role. You had, quite honestly, a lot of Republican men running for office who not only opposed abortion rights, but had, said some maybe out of step things that were not super popular among women. J.D. Vance is one of those who had a lot of issues with women voters. Blake Masters as well, very, very low favorables among women. But you also saw women candidates embracing masculinity and embracing that kind of macho attitude. I think Carrie Lake is one. She kind of styled herself as the kind of successor to Trump, but more polished and with a 20-year TV background. But yeah, she definitely kind of leaned into that masculinity, bombastic, theatrical style of politics more than a lot of others. And yeah, and I think a lot of candidates think that they need to lean into that. And we saw that a lot this year in races across the board.
So counterfactual, if Carrie Lake had done everything that she did in Arizona, but backed off from the election denial and separated herself a little bit from Trump, does she win?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say because I don't think there is a Carrie Lake campaign without election denial and Trump.
Fair enough.
That's what she leaned into that harder than any other candidate. But honestly, I think she could have had if she had run a different campaign and kind of embraced kind of a MAGA light style of politics without fully going stop the steal and being arm in arm with Trump, she may have done better and kind of fit the electorate better. I think that's what a lot of the losing candidates had in common this year on the Republican side, is they kind of failed to meet where their voters were at. And I think she was one of them, despite her skill, political skill.
Okay, we're going to give you an opportunity to address your boss, Terry, again for a moment. Your boss comes to you and she says, or she says, you have an unlimited budget, you have unlimited time, you can get access to any data you want, do any survey you want. What are the three most important things that you would want to know if you lived in that completely unrealistic but ideal world?
Yeah, so I personally have a very strong interest in state courts and state legislatures, both emerging as particularly powerful battlegrounds now. It's really hard to pull state Supreme Court races in a lot of ways, sometimes because the way some states elect their state Supreme Court judges is really weird. And there are often high numbers of undecideds in those polls, but I would just love more data, because the state Supreme Court's also a really interesting outcome out of 2022. Even as Democrats did much better than expected nationwide, Republicans still flipped control of the North Carolina and Ohio Supreme Courts, which is really, really significant. And there are a couple of other really interesting results. Obviously, there's a big Supreme Court race in Wisconsin next spring, so I would just love more data on voting behavior, better polling data for state court races in general, and breaking down how the gender gaps and kind of the cross sections of the data in those races. That's one thing. Ooh, I have two others. I have so much power. I'm really interested. Obviously, I'm in Alaska. A big story this year was a Democrat, Mary Peltola, winning the House race there. I'd really be interested in more data on how she did that. I was supposed to go to Alaska for a reporting trip this June, and I got COVID right before. So I want to do that, want to make that a reality, because it's such a fascinating state. And then, on the state legislative level too, I know it's been also very hard and very expensive to poll state legislative races. Polling in general has gotten harder in a lot of ways. We'll hear more about that from Charles Franklin later. I would also really interested in the gender splits in state house races and things like ballot roll off and ballot drop off too.
Okay, so the mentioning Alaska made me think of this. Do you think different voting rules other than single member plurality, ranked choice voting, top two primaries, do you think that has a particular effect on the success of women running for office?
Yes, and I think I talked for a story earlier this year, someone from Fair Vote, which is a major group that advocates for ranked choice voting. And I don't have the exact research numbers to back this up at the moment, but she did indicate that ranked choice boosts the diversity in some primary fields a lot more and does benefit women candidates when you have a majority or instead of a plurality vote. I think it would. So for example, in 2020, in my home state of Massachusetts, there was a very competitive House primary with 9 candidates and at least 2 or 3 progressive women. And the more moderate male candidate, Jake Auchincloss, he won with 24% of the vote or something. So I think it probably ranked choice and non-plurality voting probably does help women candidates and candidates of color.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. One thing that is completely obvious in contemporary campaigns is the sort of generational effects and media consumption patterns, that younger voters are far less likely to get their news from traditional sources of news, and young people are. What is, if any, is the relationship between social media and those news consumption patterns or let me phrase it somewhat different. Is there any reason to expect that a differential effect based on gender? Does that help, hurt, make no difference to women running for office or affect voting behavior of women relative to men?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I feel like when it comes to media consumption, I feel like partisanship and age are better predictors of what strategies are better and more useful. But what I will say is that, younger generations, Gen Z, are way less likely to watch cable news where a lot of television advertising takes place than older generations. And that's why I think for campaigns targeting younger folks, this concept of relational organizing, getting young people to talk to other young people about candidates and races and politics is especially important because younger generations are super interconnected via social media, via their social networks, are less likely to watch large amounts of cable television. And so I think it's more age dependent. I'm not sure about.
So just as someone, speaking as someone who's definitely very much not Gen Z, when did Gen Z start?
The Pew Research Center defines the start of Gen Z as 1997 until 2012. And then after that, it's Gen Alpha, who are just getting their first iPads and smartphones very shortly.
Okay, we have high praise indeed from David Cannon, my colleague, who says you are an election nerd.
Thank you.
And he asks, as an election administration nerd, what changes to election laws would you impose if not only did you have unlimited resources, time, and money from your boss, Terry, but you had a magic wand that could do anything that you wanted it to do? I added that last part.
I just speaking for myself and not on behalf of my employer. I think in terms of, and these are like non-partisan reforms that don't benefit one party over the other. I think states have made a lot of progress in increasing turnout, just the ease of the voting experience by automatic voter registration has been a big one. Obviously here in Wisconsin's early adopter of same day registration, which is important for younger voters. More states should be joining the ERIC, which is the multi-state consortium of states sharing their voter data to keep their lists clean. And then I think when it comes to mail voting, something that just eases the voting experience is paying for postage, for example, just streamlining the process, making it as easy for everyone as possible. And these are, some reforms we know that don't benefit one party over the other, but save a lot of time and a lot of money.
Okay, so I'm going to ask two more questions. One of them is you made the point in your presentation that for all of the talk about a youth quake and higher levels of youth engagement, youth voting, it still runs 20 points, 25 points behind older voters.
Yeah.
What is that possible to change, or what would you suggest as a way to try to increase those voting rates, or is it just baked in? Yeah,
and this has been a thing, in every election, it's the same question. Are young people going to turn out? Will young people turn out? I think some of it's just kind of one of these trends that's baked in to some extent. And I think it stems from the fact that older people, as opposed to younger ones, just are more engaged and more engaged at higher rates and more likely to vote. But I do think that there is definitely a lot of room for this to change. And we've seen this 2018, 2020, now in 2022, some of these upticks, especially in key states of youth turnout. And so, absolutely. And as a member of the younger generation, obviously, I want everyone to turn out and vote. And so I think a lot of it comes down to very specific modes of organizing. There's no single bullet, silver bullet magic fix. A lot of it does come down to organizing and sort of also long-term organizing instead of just dropping in and out for each election, kind of making the case to people why they should turn out, why things matter to them. And also to the point about voting reforms, definitely, you do have research showing that the earlier someone starts voting, the more likely they are to become a lifelong voter. So there are some states that allow 17-year-olds who are going to be 18 by the general to vote in the primary. That's one way to do that and get a jump start on that. It's a multifaceted thing, but I definitely think that it could turn around.
Okay, so I actually have two more questions, not just one after this. I think this is probably an unfair question to ask, but I'm going to do it anyhow because we're being recorded and this is on the record. Which of the slides in your presentation do you think you would be able to reuse if you come back here after the 2024 election?
Ooh, oh boy, gotta be careful. I think probably the slide with the data showing about how abortion is now more of a litmus test for Democrats and Republicans. That's something, yeah, I'm saying this as I'm being recorded. I think that is something that will hold in 2024 again, that a candidate's views on abortion is going to be decisive more for Democrats than Republicans and more for women than men. Yeah, I think that's the side I would be able to reuse. I think that's going to hold in the next election.
So that's the only one.
Maybe not the only one. I don't know. Maybe, yeah, but this, slide with the women of January 6th. I think especially if we get more data, more information.
Let me ask it
Yeah.
with some more specificity. Would you be more surprised if the gender gap grows larger between men and women in 2024 or smaller relative to 2022?
Ooh. I think I'd be more surprised if it got larger. I think this was such a unique year with the, preeminence of abortion being on the ballot. I feel like there will be a little bit of reversion to previous patterns, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, I guess
go either
that's all
way.
clearly going to be a function of the
Yeah.
candidates who emerge, right?
That's also
it's not
true.
exogenous to that,
Right.
which makes it tricky we're talking about national aggregations, which are in this case are the sum of a bunch of statewide races, which makes it difficult from a
Right.
presidential race. Do you think Donald Trump is going to run in 2024?
Yes.
I mean, actually, that's a stupid question. I already said it. Do you think he is actually going to be on the ballot in 2024?
The primary ballot or the general election ballot?
Well, let's do the general.
Ooh. At this point, I would say yes, but don't stake beat to that. If anything, we learned from 2016, primaries can be very unpredictable. To me, at this point, it's just like not clear which candidate could gain a majority of support to defeat him in a Republican primary. I'm not sure if DeSantis is quite there yet at this point. We still don't know what the field is going to look like and how many candidates are going to be running and split off the vote. So if I had to say right now, I would say yes, but
Okay.